As usual, if you like these stories or it felt meaningful to you, feel free to like, share, and comment your thoughts below, as well as subscribe to our channel. It could be a huge support for our work. Now, let's just enjoy the stories.
Elena Vale stood in the marble hallway of her mansion at midnight, a packed suitcase at her feet, when her husband, the most feared crime lord in the city, finally looked at her for the first time in years. Victor Hale had built an empire on control, yet he'd never noticed his wife disappearing inside their own home. Tonight, as his eyes locked on that silent suitcase, something inside him cracked. She wasn't screaming, she wasn't crying, she was simply leaving. And for a man who'd never lost anything he wanted to keep, Elena's calm resolve was the most terrifying thing he'd ever faced. Duh. Before we begin Elena's journey from shadow to light, please like this video and comment below with your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. Now, let's step into the gilded cage where love learned to breathe again. The clock in the foyer struck midnight with a crystalline chime that echoed through 20,000 square feet of imported marble, custom millwork, and calculated perfection. Elena Vale heard it the way she heard everything in this house, as background noise to a life that had somehow become someone else's. She stood before the full-length mirror in her dressing room, studying the woman reflected there with the clinical detachment of someone examining a stranger. Silk pajamas in champagne, hair still perfect from this afternoon's salon appointment, skin that glowed from products that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Everything about her screamed wealth, privilege, success. Everything except her eyes. Those told a different story entirely. Elena turned away from her reflection and moved to the walk-in closet that was larger than the first apartment she'd ever rented. Her hands, steady and sure, pulled a leather suitcase from the top shelf. Not the Louis Vuitton set Victor had given her for their second anniversary, but the simple black case she'd owned since college. The one that had moved her into 3 different cities, 2 different dreams, and eventually into this mansion that had become her beautifully appointed prison. She didn't pack frantically. There was no desperate shoving of clothes into corners, no tearful selection of sentimental items. Instead, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd been planning this moment for longer than she cared to admit. 3 pairs of jeans, 4 simple tops, underwear, toiletries. The leather journal her sister had given her 5 years ago, still mostly empty because there'd been nothing worth recording. Her grandmother's bracelet. The photograph of her parents on their 20th anniversary, smiling at each other like they shared a secret the rest of the world would never understand. She left behind the designer gowns that hung like colorful ghosts, the jewelry that had marked occasions she couldn't remember feeling present for, the 1,000 small luxuries that had somehow become substitutes for the one thing money couldn't buy: being seen, being known, being real to the person who slept 3 feet away from her every night. Elena zipped the suitcase closed and stood there for a moment, listening to the vast silence of the house. Somewhere below, Victor was probably in his study, having one of his late-night calls with associates whose names she'd learned not to ask about. Or perhaps he was in the security room, watching the dozen screens that showed every angle of their property, protecting an empire while remaining completely blind to what was happening inside his own home. She'd stopped trying to figure out which version of absent he would be on any given night. The suitcase felt lighter than it should have as she carried it down the sweeping staircase, past the Monet in the second-floor hallway, past the Italian chandelier that had cost more than her mother's annual salary, past all the beautiful things that were supposed to mean they'd made it. She was halfway across the foyer when she heard his voice. "It's late for a trip." Elena's hand tightened on the suitcase handle, but she didn't turn around. Not yet. She needed one more second to gather herself, to remember why this moment mattered, to hold on to the clarity that had taken her 3 years to find. When she finally turned, Victor was standing at the entrance to the hallway that led to his study. He hadn't changed from his business meeting, still in the charcoal suit that made his broad shoulders look even more imposing, still wearing the watch that cost more than most cars, still projecting the kind of power that made other men step aside when he entered a room. But for the first time in years, he wasn't looking through her. He was actually looking at her. And there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Something that might have been fear. "I wasn't planning to ask permission," Elena said quietly. The words hung in the air between them, simple and devastating. Victor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. To anyone else, he would have looked completely composed. But Elena had spent 6 years learning to read the micro-expressions that flickered across his face before the mask slammed back into place. She saw the moment her words landed, saw him processing what that suitcase meant, saw the calculation happening behind those dark eyes. Elena. Her name came out rougher than she'd heard it in months. What's going on? She almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. What's going on? As if the past 3 years hadn't been a slow erasure, as if she hadn't disappeared right in front of him while he looked everywhere except at her. I'm leaving, Victor. 3 words, simple, clear, final. He took a step forward, then stopped, as if suddenly uncertain of the distance between them. A man who commanded rooms full of dangerous people, frozen by his wife's calm resolve. Leaving, he repeated, testing the word like it was in a language he didn't speak. Because of what? The Castellano situation? That's handled. The security concerns are, this has nothing to do with your business. Elena's voice remained steady, though something inside her chest was cracking. This has to do with us. Or rather, the fact that there is no us. Not really. Not for a long time. That's not true. The words came quickly, defensively. Isn't it? Elena set the suitcase down, and the soft thud it made against the marble seemed to echo through the entire house. When was the last time you asked me about my day, Victor? Not as a formality, not in passing. Actually asked and waited to hear the answer? He opened his mouth, then closed it again. When was the last time we had dinner together? Just us? No business associates? No strategy sessions disguised as meals? Silence. When was the last time you touched me and I felt like you were actually present for it? Like I was more than just furniture? Elena, that's not fair. Fair? The word came out sharper than she intended, and she saw him flinch. Good. Let him feel something. Anything. I've been invisible in my own marriage for 3 years, Victor. I've watched you give more attention to strangers than you've given me. I've sat across from you at dinner parties and watched you come alive for everyone in the room, except the woman you supposedly married for love. Tell me what part of that is fair. Victor's hand came up to his jaw, that gesture he made when he was thinking, strategizing, looking for the angle that would give him control of the situation. But this wasn't a negotiation with a rival family. This wasn't a business deal gone sideways. This was his wife telling him she'd had enough of being a ghost in her own life. You have everything you could want, he said finally, and Elena heard the bewilderment in his voice. He genuinely didn't understand. This house, security, freedom to pursue whatever interests you. I don't have a husband. The words cut through his justifications like a blade. I have a man I share an address with, a man who provides material comfort while offering absolutely nothing of himself. Do you know what that feels like, Victor? To be so close to someone and yet completely alone? She watched something flicker across his face, something that might have been recognition or pain, or perhaps the first crack in the armor he'd spent years constructing. I give you space, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. I thought that's what you wanted. After everything with... He stopped, jaw working. I thought distance was safer. Safer for who? Elena asked softly. Because it's been killing me. The admission hung between them like a living thing. Victor stared at her, and for a moment she saw past the crime lord, past the calculated control, to the man she'd fallen in love with 7 years ago. The man who'd quoted poetry at her in a bookstore, who'd stayed up all night talking about everything and nothing, who'd made her feel like the only person in the world who mattered. Before the empire consumed him, before the violence and the danger and the constant threat taught him that vulnerability was weakness, before he'd decided that the best way to protect her was to keep her at arm's length. I never meant to hurt you, Victor said, and the rawness in his voice almost broke her resolve. Almost. I know, Elena replied, but you did it anyway. Every day. Every silence. Every time you looked through me like I was transparent. Every night you came to bed and turned away without a word. Death by 1,000 cuts, Victor, and I'm bleeding out. He moved toward her then, one hand reaching out, and she saw the desperation starting to crack through his composure. Elena, please, we can... We can what? She didn't step back, but she didn't move closer either. Have the same conversation we've had a dozen times, the one where you promised to be more present, and I believe you, and then 3 days later we're right back to this? The one where you explain that your work is demanding and dangerous, and I should understand that your distance is protection? I'm done with that script, Victor. I'm done performing a marriage for the outside world while dying of loneliness on the inside. So you're just giving up? There was accusation in his tone now, and anger starting to simmer beneath the shock. After everything I've built, everything I've provided, you built an empire, Elena interrupted. But somewhere along the way you forgot to build a marriage. You can't buy intimacy, Victor. You can't protect someone into loving you. And you can't expect a relationship to survive when one person has to disappear to make the other comfortable. Victor's hand dropped to his side. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Really looked at her. And Elena wondered if this was the first time in 3 years he'd actually seen her. Not the decorative wife, not the liability to be protected, not the symbol of everything he'd achieved. Just her. Elena. The woman who'd loved him enough to marry into a life she'd never imagined and who'd lost herself somewhere in the process. I don't know how to do this, he said finally, and the admission seemed to cost him something fundamental. I don't know how to be what you need and keep you safe at the same time. Then maybe you can't keep me at all, Elena said softly. Because I need to be more than safe, Victor. I need to be alive. And this? She gestured at the beautiful foyer, at the mansion around them, at the gilded cage that looked like success. This isn't living, it's existing, and I'm done with it. She picked up her suitcase again, and the sound of it seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Where will you go? Victor's voice was hoarse. My sister's, then I'll figure it out from there. It's not safe. Victor. She met his eyes, and this time she let him see everything. The pain, the loneliness, the slow death of hope she'd experienced while sleeping next to him night after night. Staying is what's not safe. Not for me. Not anymore. She walked toward the door, each step feeling both impossibly heavy and strangely weightless. Her hand was on the doorknob when his voice stopped her one more time. What do I have to do? The question was raw, stripped of pride. To make you stay. What do I have to do? Elena turned back to face him, and for a moment she let herself feel the full weight of what she was walking away from. The man she'd loved, the life she'd imagined, the hope that somehow, someday, he'd find his way back to her. But hope wasn't enough anymore. Not without action, not without change, not without him being willing to tear down the walls he'd spent years building. You'd have to actually want me to stay, she said quietly. Not the idea of me, not the symbol of stability I represent. Not the wife who makes you look legitimate to the outside world. Miss Elena, the woman you haven't had a real conversation with in 2 years, the woman whose favorite color you probably don't remember, the woman who's been drowning in silence while you convinced yourself that distance was love. Victor's face was unreadable, but his hands had curled into fists at his sides. You'd have to be willing to let me in, Elena continued. To tell me the truth about what you're feeling instead of deciding for both of us what I can handle. You'd have to stop treating me like a porcelain doll that might shatter if you touch it with real emotion. You'd have to trust me enough to be vulnerable. She paused, watching him process her words. And most of all, she said, you'd have to actually want to do those things. Not because I'm standing here with a suitcase. Not because you're afraid of losing your wife. But because you genuinely want a real marriage more than you want the comfortable distance you've been hiding behind. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. I don't know if I can be that person, Victor said finally, and at least there was honesty in the admission. I know, Elena replied. That's why I'm leaving. She turned the doorknob, and the cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of jasmine from the garden and the promise of a life that was hers to define. Behind her, she heard Victor take a sharp breath, heard the sound of him moving, and for a wild second she thought he might physically stop her. But he didn't, because even now, even in this moment, he was still trying to protect her by letting her go. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much. Elena, her name was barely a whisper. I never stopped loving you. She looked back at him one more time, memorizing the man who'd given her everything except what she actually needed. I know, Victor, she said softly. But love isn't enough when you can't share yourself. And I can't keep disappearing to make your version of love work. Then she walked through the door, pulling her suitcase behind her, leaving behind the mansion and the marriage, and the man who'd loved her enough to marry her, but not enough to truly let her in. The door closed with a soft click that sounded like an ending. Inside the foyer, Victor Hale stood alone, staring at the space where his wife had been, realizing for the first time that all his power, all his control, all his carefully constructed empire meant absolutely nothing if he'd lost the only person who'd ever made him feel human. His hand came up to his chest, pressing against the unfamiliar ache there, and for the first time in 15 years, the man who never cried felt tears burning behind his eyes. Outside, Elena walked to the car she'd arranged earlier. Not one of Victor's armored vehicles, but a simple rideshare that represented the first choice she'd made entirely for herself in years. She slid into the back seat, gave the driver her sister's address, and watched through the window as the mansion grew smaller in the distance. She didn't cry. There was a strange clarity in her chest, a sense of having finally chosen herself after years of choosing silence. It hurt. God, it hurt like nothing she'd ever experienced, but it was clean pain, honest pain, the kind that came from setting a broken bone, knowing it would heal stronger if she had the courage to let it. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Victor's name lit up the screen. She turned the phone off without reading the message. Whatever he had to say now, in the immediate aftermath of shock, wouldn't be real. It would be panic. It would be the same promises she'd heard before, the ones that lasted just long enough for her to hope before dissolving back into silence. If Victor wanted her back, he was going to have to do more than text. He was going to have to fundamentally change who he'd become. And she had no idea if he was even capable of that. The car pulled onto the highway, leaving the gated community behind, and Elena finally let out the breath she felt like she'd been holding for 3 years. The city lights blurred past the window, each one representing a life being lived, a story being written, a person making choices that mattered. She was going to be one of those people again. Not Victor Hale's wife, not the elegant decoration in the mansion, not the silent partner in a marriage that had forgotten what partnership meant. Just Elena. Figuring out who she was when no one was watching. Rebuilding a life that felt real, even if it meant doing it alone. Especially if it meant doing it alone. Behind her, miles away, Victor stood in his study staring at his phone, watching the message go unread, feeling the full weight of what he'd lost crashing down around him. He'd built an empire on the premise that control was everything. That distance meant safety, that love meant protection, even if that protection looked like absence. He'd been wrong, and now the only woman who'd ever mattered was gone, and all his power couldn't bring her back. He looked around the study, the leather furniture, the expensive art, the floor-to-ceiling windows that showed his domain spread out below. All of it meaningless without her, all of it hollow. For the first time in his adult life, Victor Hale had absolutely no idea what to do next. The only thing he knew with certainty was that the path he'd been on, the one that valued control over connection, safety over intimacy, empire over emotion, had led him here. To this moment, standing alone in a house full of beautiful things, having lost the only beautiful thing that mattered. The question was whether he had the courage to become a different man, not for strategy, not for appearance, but because he genuinely wanted the life he'd been too afraid to build. Whether he could tear down the walls he'd spent 15 years constructing and risk the vulnerability he'd been running from since long before he met Elena. Whether loving her was enough to make him brave enough to change. He didn't know the answer, but for the first time in 3 years, he was asking the right question. And somewhere across the city, Elena was asking her own questions. About who she'd been before she became someone's wife. About what she wanted from a life that was entirely her own. About whether the love she still felt for Victor, because it was still there, buried beneath the hurt, could ever coexist with the self-respect she was fighting to reclaim. She didn't have those answers yet either, but she had something she hadn't had in years, the space to find out. The car pulled up in front of her sister's apartment building, and Elena grabbed her suitcase, tipped the driver, and stood on the sidewalk looking up at the modest building that represented everything her marriage hadn't been. Simple, honest, real. Her sister's light was on. She'd be awake, waiting, ready to offer the support Elena had been too proud to ask for until now. Elena walked toward the building, toward the beginning of whatever came next, carrying nothing but a single suitcase and the fragile, terrifying hope that somewhere on the other side of this ending, she might find a version of herself worth knowing. Behind her, the city stretched out in all directions, full of possibility and pain, endings and beginnings, the thousand small deaths and resurrections that made up a life actually lived. She didn't look back, not yet. There would be time for looking back later, time for processing the marriage that had been, time for deciding if the man she'd left behind could become the man she needed. But tonight was for moving forward, for choosing herself, for learning to breathe again after years of holding her breath, for remembering that sometimes the most loving thing you could do, for yourself and for the person you loved, was to refuse to disappear. Even if it meant walking away from everything you'd built together. Even if it meant starting over alone. Even if it meant your heart broke with every step. Because a broken heart that was still beating was better than a silent one that had learned to stop feeling altogether. And Elena Vale was done being silent. The door to her sister's building opened, warm light spilling out into the night, and Elena walked toward it with the kind of courage that only comes from hitting bottom and choosing to climb back up. Behind her, the night held its breath. Ahead of her, the future waited, uncertain, terrifying, and entirely her own. And for the first time in 3 years, that felt like enough. Sarah Martinez opened her apartment door before Elena could knock, as if she'd been standing there waiting. Her sister's eyes swept over the single suitcase, the rumpled silk pajamas visible beneath Elena's coat, the careful composure that was already starting to crack around the edges. "Come here," Sarah said simply, pulling Elena into a hug that smelled like coffee and lavender detergent and everything that was real and uncomplicated. Elena held on longer than she meant to, her face pressed against her sister's shoulder, feeling the tears she'd held back during the entire drive finally threatening to surface. But she swallowed them down, pulled back, and managed something that almost resembled a smile. "Sorry for the late-night drama," Elena said. "Please. You think this is drama? Last month, Mrs. Chen from 3B called me at 2 in the morning because she was convinced her cat was possessed. This is practically mundane." Sarah grabbed the suitcase and pulled Elena inside. "Besides, it's about damn time." The apartment was small, a fraction of the size of the mansion Elena had just left, but it felt alive in a way her home hadn't in years. Books stacked on every surface, plants that were actually thriving, mismatched furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than aesthetics. A life that looked lived in rather than staged. Elena sank onto the worn couch while Sarah disappeared into the kitchen, returning moments later with 2 glasses of wine and the kind of determination that meant there would be no escaping this conversation. "So," Sarah said, settling into the armchair across from her, "you finally did it." "I finally did it," Elena confirmed, taking a long sip of wine. "How do you feel?" It was such a simple question, but Elena found herself struggling to answer it. How did she feel? Terrified, relieved, heartbroken, free, like she'd just jumped off a cliff and had no idea if there was water below or rocks. "Ask me tomorrow," she said finally. Sarah studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Fair enough. Guest room's ready whenever you want it. Clean sheets, towels in the closet. Stay as long as you need." "Sarah, I can't just—" "Yes, you can, and you will, because that's what people do when someone they love has been slowly disappearing for 3 years. They give them a place to remember who they were before they learn to make themselves small." The words hit harder than Elena expected. She set down her wine glass before her shaking hands could betray her. "I didn't think it was that obvious," she said quietly. "It wasn't, not to most people. Victor's good at presenting the perfect image, and you learn to play your part beautifully. But I'm your sister, Elena. I've known you since you were 6 years old and convinced Mom that you could definitely keep a lizard alive. I noticed when your eyes stopped lighting up, when your laugh started sounding rehearsed, when you stopped calling me with random thoughts and only reached out to schedule obligatory family dinners." Elena looked away, unable to meet her sister's eyes. "I didn't mean to shut you out." "I know you didn't. That's how it works with people like Victor. They don't demand you disappear. They just create a reality where disappearing feels like the only option." Sarah leaned forward. "But you're here now. That's what matters." They sat in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable quiet that only existed between people who'd shared a lifetime of moments. Outside, the city hummed with late-night traffic and distant sirens, and all the sounds of people living messy, complicated, real lives. Elena's phone, still turned off in her pocket, felt like a weight. "He's going to call," Sarah said, reading her mind the way she always had. "Text, show up, send flowers, deploy the whole arsenal." "I know. You ready for that?" Elena thought about Victor standing in the foyer, the rawness in his voice when he'd asked what he had to do, the fear in his eyes when he'd realized she was actually leaving, the 15 years of walls he'd built brick by brick to protect himself from the kind of vulnerability that had once nearly destroyed him. "No," she admitted, "but I don't think I'd ever be ready. And if I waited until I was ready, I'd wait forever." Sarah raised her glass in a small salute. "To doing hard things scared." "To doing hard things scared," Elena echoed, and they drank to uncertain futures and the courage it took to choose yourself. The guest room was small but welcoming, with a window that looked out over the street and a bed that had been made with obvious care. Elena changed into actual pajamas, the simple cotton ones she'd packed, not the silk ones that belonged to Victor's wife, and slid between sheets that smelled like fresh laundry instead of the expensive detergent the mansion's housekeeping service used. She should have been exhausted. Instead, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the conversation in the foyer on an endless loop. The look on Victor's face when he'd seen the suitcase, the way his control had cracked, the admission that he didn't know how to be what she needed. At least that had been honest. Somewhere across the city, Victor was probably in his study, making calls or reviewing security footage, or doing whatever it was he did in the hours when normal people slept. Or maybe, for the first time in years, he was lying awake too, realizing what the silence in his house actually sounded like when it wasn't filled with Elena's quiet presence. Her phone sat on the nightstand, still off. She stared at it for a long moment, then deliberately turned away and closed her eyes. Whatever messages were waiting could wait until morning, until she'd had time to remember who Elena Vale was when she wasn't performing the role of Victor Hale's wife. Sleep came eventually, restless and full of dreams that dissolved the moment she woke. Morning arrived with weak sunlight through unfamiliar curtains and the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen. Elena found Sarah already dressed for work, dumping an aggressive amount of sugar into her travel mug. "There's breakfast stuff in the fridge," Sarah said, grabbing her keys. "Make yourself at home. Use whatever you need. I'll be back around 6. Sarah, don't thank me. Just promise me you'll eat something today. And maybe turn your phone on at some point, because I guarantee your husband is losing his mind." Elena managed a weak smile. "He's not used to not being in control." "Then it's good for him to learn." Sarah paused at the door. "You doing okay? Really?" "I will be," Elena said, and hoped it was true. After Sarah left, the apartment settled into quiet. Elena made coffee, picked at a piece of toast, and finally, with the kind of dread usually reserved for diffusing bombs, turned on her phone. The screen immediately exploded with notifications. 17 missed calls from Victor, 32 text messages, 6 voicemails, and that was just from the last 8 hours. Elena scrolled through the texts with a strange detachment, watching the progression from confusion to concern to desperation to something that looked almost like panic. "Elena, please call me. We need to talk about this. At least let me know you're safe. I know you're angry, but this isn't the solution, please. Just come home and we'll figure this out. I can't do this if you won't talk to me. Elena, please." The messages got progressively less coherent as the night went on, Victor's usual precision dissolving into something raw and unfiltered. She could almost see him pacing his study, typing and deleting and typing again, watching his control slip through his fingers. Part of her wanted to respond, wanted to ease his panic, assure him she was safe, fall back into the familiar pattern of managing his emotions so he didn't have to. But that was exactly the problem. She'd spent 3 years making herself smaller so Victor could stay comfortable, swallowing her needs so he didn't have to confront his fear of intimacy. Accepting silence because asking for more made her feel demanding, needy, difficult. She was done with that version of herself. Elena deleted the messages without responding and opened her email instead. There were practical things to handle. Her checking account, which Victor had insisted she didn't need because he handled all the finances. The credit cards in her name that were tied to his accounts. The car lease. The club memberships. The 1,000 small threads that had woven their lives together. She'd need to untangle all of it. Build her own financial foundation. Remember how to exist as a separate person, rather than half of a unit. The thought was exhausting. It was also exhilarating. She was working her way through opening a new bank account when her phone rang. Not Victor this time. His mother. Elena stared at the name on the screen, debating. Catherine Hale had always been kind to her, in a distant, aristocratic sort of way, but she was also fiercely protective of her son and the family legacy. This call wasn't going to be pleasant. She answered anyway. Elena, darling. Catherine's voice was warm honey over steel. Victor called me this morning. He's quite upset. I imagine he is. He said you left. With a suitcase. In the middle of the night. That's accurate. There was a pause, and Elena could practically hear Catherine recalculating her approach. Darling, I know marriage can be challenging, especially with a man like Victor, who has so many responsibilities. But walking out isn't the answer. You made a commitment. A commitment requires two people, Catherine. Elena kept her voice level. Not one person trying to have a marriage while the other builds walls. Victor has his reasons for being reserved. After what happened with Marcus, I know about Marcus. Everyone knew about Marcus Castellano, Victor's former best friend and business partner who'd betrayed him spectacularly 5 years ago, who'd used personal information against him, nearly destroyed his empire, and taught Victor that vulnerability was a weapon people would use against you. I know that betrayal changed him, but I can't spend the rest of my life paying for someone else's sins. Catherine was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened slightly. What do you want, Elena? A husband who actually talks to me, who trusts me enough to let me in, who doesn't treat intimacy like a security breach. Elena walked to the window, watching people on the street below living their complicated, messy lives. I want what you and Victor's father had. The partnership I saw in the photos from your anniversary parties. Two people who actually shared their lives instead of just coexisting in the same space. Robert and I had our difficulties too, Catherine said quietly. There were years when the distance felt unbearable. But he changed. Victor told me that story about how your father had to learn to trust you with the truth about the business. How he almost lost you because he was trying to protect you from reality. He did almost lose me. I packed my bags twice before he finally understood that I needed to be a partner, not a decoration. Catherine sighed. Elena, I'm not saying you're wrong to want more. I'm just asking you to consider whether you've given him a real chance to change. I've given him 3 years, Catherine. 3 years of asking for more, of trying to get him to open up, of making myself smaller and quieter, hoping that would make him comfortable enough to let me in. How much more of myself am I supposed to sacrifice? None, Catherine said, surprising her. You're right. You shouldn't have to disappear to make him comfortable. But you should know. He called me at 4 a.m. Victor, who never asked for help, who's handled every crisis in his life alone since he was 16 years old, called me crying. I've heard my son cry exactly 3 times in his adult life. His father's funeral, the day Marcus betrayed him, and last night. Elena's chest tightened. She didn't want to feel sympathy, didn't want to soften, didn't want to let his pain pull her back before she'd even figured out who she was without him. I'm sorry he's hurting, she said carefully, but that doesn't change what I need. I know, and I'm not asking you to come back before you're ready. I'm just asking you not to close the door completely. Give him a chance to prove he can be different, not the panicked promises he's probably making right now. Real, sustained change. The kind that takes time and work and genuine commitment. And if he can't, then you'll have your answer. And as much as I love my son, I'll understand. Catherine paused. But Elena, don't let fear make you give up on something that might still be worth fighting for. I almost did. It would have been the biggest mistake of my life. After the call ended, Elena sat with Catherine's words echoing in her head. She thought about Victor's parents, about the strong partnership they'd eventually built, about the photos she'd seen of them at various events, the way Robert Hale had looked at his wife like she hung the moon, the obvious respect between them. That's what she'd thought she was marrying into. That's what Victor had promised, in the early days when he'd been open and vulnerable and real. Before Marcus's betrayal taught him that being real was dangerous, before he'd decided that the best way to love her was to keep her at a distance, before silence became their primary language. Her phone buzzed with another text. Not Victor this time. Her best friend Maya, who must have heard the news through whatever mysterious network kept people informed about these things. Sarah told me, coming over tonight with wine and Thai food. No is not an option. Elena smiled despite everything. This was what she'd been missing. People who showed up, who didn't wait for permission to care, who understood that sometimes support looked like wine and Thai food and refusing to let you isolate. She spent the rest of the day doing aggressively normal things. Showering, getting dressed in her own clothes, jeans and a sweater that had been buried in her closet for months because they didn't fit the image of Victor Hale's wife. Walking to the corner coffee shop and ordering something that wasn't green tea because Victor insisted green tea was healthier. Sitting in the coffee shop and reading a book just because she wanted to, not because it would make good conversation at one of Victor's business dinners. Existing as herself without performing for anyone. It felt strange. Foreign. Like wearing shoes that almost fit but not quite, because she'd forgotten what her actual size was. But it also felt like breathing. She was on her second cup of coffee when a shadow fell across her table. Elena looked up, expecting Sarah or maybe Maya arriving early, and found herself staring at someone she hadn't seen in 6 months. James Chen, Victor's head of security, and the closest thing Victor had to a friend. "Mrs. Hale," he said quietly. "May I sit?" Elena gestured to the empty chair, her guard immediately up. "Did Victor send you?" "No, he doesn't know I'm here. Probably fire me if he found out." James sat, looking uncomfortable in civilian clothes, jeans and a jacket instead of his usual suit. "I wanted to check on you, make sure you were safe." "I'm fine, as you can see. I can see you're alive and unharmed." Fine is a different question. James studied her with the kind of attention he usually reserved for security threats. "He's a mess, you know, Victor. I've never seen him like this. James, I'm not here to convince you to go back. That's not my place. I'm here because—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "Because I've worked for Victor for 8 years. I've seen him handle every kind of crisis. Rival families, federal investigations, attempts on his life. He's always been completely controlled, completely strategic. But the last 24 hours? He's falling apart." "Good," Elena said, and meant it. Maybe that's what he needs, to actually feel something instead of calculating his way around it. "You're not wrong." James leaned back. "You know why he hired me? After Marcus. I was the first person he brought into his inner circle after that whole thing went down. You want to know what he said in my interview?" Elena waited. He said he needed someone who understood that trust was a liability, that closeness was a weakness, that the only way to survive was to keep everyone at arm's length and never let anyone see the whole picture. James shook his head. "I told him that was a good way to build an empire, but a terrible way to build a life. He hired me anyway. I think part of him knew I was right, even if he wasn't ready to admit it." "What changed?" Elena asked, "between when I married him and when he turned into someone I didn't recognize?" "Nothing changed. That's the problem." James met her eyes. "He was already building those walls when you met him. You just made him want to be different. For about 2 years, he tried, really tried, opened up more than I'd ever seen. Let himself be vulnerable. Started to believe that maybe trust wasn't always a liability." "What happened?" "You remember the Castellano situation? About 3 years ago?" Elena nodded. How could she forget? It had been all over the news. Another attempt by Marcus's remaining associates to destabilize Victor's operations. They'd gotten close. Dangerously close. "They went after you," James said quietly. "Surveillance on the house, photos, plans to use you as leverage. Victor found out about it before anything happened, but it scared him in a way I'd never seen. Made him realize that loving you made him vulnerable. That every time he let you in, he was giving potential enemies a weapon to use against him. So he pushed me away to protect me." Elena's laugh was bitter. "How noble." "It was stupid," James corrected. "I told him that. Told him he was destroying the thing he was trying to protect. But fear makes people irrational, even people as smart as Victor. Especially people like Victor, who learned young that the only person you can really trust is yourself." Elena sat with that information, feeling pieces click into place. The timing matched. 3 years ago was when everything had started to shift. When Victor had started working later, speaking less, building walls between them that grew higher every day. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because you deserve to know that his distance wasn't about you. It was never about you not being enough or not being worth the effort. It was about him being so terrified of losing you that he pushed you away before anyone else could take you." James stood. "Doesn't make it right. Doesn't erase the hurt. But maybe it helps to know the why." "It doesn't change anything," Elena said. "Understanding why he did it doesn't make the last 3 years hurt less." "No, but it might help you decide if he's worth giving a real chance to change. Not the man he's been, the man he could be if he got out of his own way." James pulled out a card and set it on the table. "This is my personal cell. You need anything, someone following you, security concerns, or just someone to talk to who gets it, you call me, day or night. Victor won't like you being in contact with me. Victor can fire me if he wants. Some things matter more than a job." James headed toward the door, then turned back. "For what it's worth, I think you did the right thing, leaving. Maybe it's the only thing that could actually get through to him, make him realize what he's about to lose." After he left, Elena stared at the card on the table. James Chen, a phone number, a lifeline she hadn't asked for but found herself grateful to have. She thought about what he'd said, about Victor's fear, about the Castellano situation she hadn't known had targeted her specifically, about a man so terrified of vulnerability that he'd chosen loneliness over risk. It explained things, but it didn't fix them. Understanding the source of the walls didn't make them any less real, didn't make the last 3 years of silence any less painful, didn't change the fact that she'd slowly disappeared while he convinced himself he was keeping her safe. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Victor. "I'm not giving up on us." Short, simple, different from the panicked rambling of last night. Elena stared at the message for a long moment, then typed a reply. The first communication she'd sent since walking out, then prove it, not with words, with action, with real, sustained change. "Show me the man I married is still in there somewhere." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. The response came almost immediately. "I will. Whatever it takes." Elena turned off her phone and finished her coffee, watching people through the window, living their lives, making their own choices, fighting their own battles. She didn't know if Victor could actually change, didn't know if the man who'd built his entire empire on control and distance could learn to be vulnerable, didn't know if love was enough to overcome years of fear and self-protection. But for the first time in 3 years, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She wasn't going to disappear again. Wasn't going to make herself small. Wasn't going to accept silence as love. Whether Victor learned to meet her where she was, or whether she built a life without him, Elena Vale was done being invisible. She was choosing herself. And if he wanted to be part of that life, he was going to have to choose differently too. The question was whether he had the courage to try. Only time would tell. But for now, Elena had wine and Thai food and her best friend to look forward to, had a sister who'd welcomed her without judgment, had a life that was messy and uncertain but entirely her own. And that, she was discovering, was enough. Maya arrived at 6:30 with enough Thai food to feed a small army and the kind of righteous fury that only best friends could properly deploy. "I'm going to say this once, and then we're going to eat and drink and not talk about him unless you want to," Maya announced, setting bags on Sarah's kitchen counter. "Victor Hale is an idiot. A well-dressed, powerful, obscenely wealthy idiot, but an idiot nonetheless. You are a goddess who deserves someone who actually sees you." End of speech. Elena felt something loosen in her chest. The first real laugh she'd managed in days. "That's it? I expected at least a 10-minute rant." "Oh, I have a 10-minute rant prepared. Also a 20-minute version and a full hour-long presentation with visual aids. But Sarah said you needed support, not a prosecution." Maya pulled containers from bags with aggressive efficiency. "So, pad thai, green curry, spring rolls, and mango sticky rice, because comfort food is a legitimate coping mechanism." Sarah emerged from her bedroom in sweatpants, took one look at the spread, and nodded approvingly. "Maya, you're my new favorite person." I accept this honor with grace and humility, Maya said, then turned to Elena. Okay, I lied. I have one more thing to say. I'm proud of you. Walking away from that life? That took guts. They settled around Sarah's small dining table, and for a while the conversation stayed deliberately light. Maya's disastrous date with a guy who'd brought his mother to dinner. Sarah's ongoing battle with her upstairs neighbor, who practiced trumpet at 2 in the morning. The kind of mundane chaos that made up normal life. Elena found herself relaxing into it, remembering what it felt like to just exist without constantly monitoring herself, without wondering if her laughter was too loud or her opinions too strong or her presence too much. So, Maya said eventually, reaching for her second glass of wine, what's the plan? And before you say you don't have one, that's fine. We're excellent at winging it. I need to find a job, Elena said. Open my own accounts. Figure out where I'm actually going to live long term. You can stay here as long as you need, Sarah interjected. Seriously, I like having you around. Place feels less empty. And the job thing, what are you thinking? Maya leaned forward. You have that art history degree collecting dust. The event planning experience from all those charity galas. Plus you're fluent in 3 languages and can manage difficult personalities without breaking a sweat, which is basically a superpower. Elena picked at her pad thai, considering. Before Victor, she'd been working toward a position at a museum, had dreams of curating exhibits, of bringing art to people who thought places like that weren't for them. Then she'd gotten married, and those dreams had somehow gotten shelved in favor of being the perfect wife, the ideal hostess, the beautiful accessory. I don't even know if I'm qualified anymore, she admitted. It's been 6 years. The field has probably moved on without me. So you catch up, Sarah said simply. You're one of the smartest people I know, Elena. You learned conversational Russian in 4 months just because you were bored. Pretty sure you can figure out what's changed in the art world. Maya nodded enthusiastically. Plus I know people. Janine from college? She's a director at the Contemporary Arts Center now. I could reach out, see if they need anyone. I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm offering. There's a difference. Maya pointed her fork at Elena. You spent 6 years making yourself smaller. Let us help you remember how to take up space again. Elena felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. She'd forgotten this. The easy give and take of friendship. The way people who actually cared about you showed up without needing to be asked. The safety of being around people who wanted you to be more, not less. Thank you, she said quietly. Both of you. I don't know what I'd do without... Her phone rang, cutting through the moment. Victor's name lit up the screen. The table went silent. Maya and Sarah both looked at her, waiting to follow her lead. Elena stared at the phone, her heart rate picking up despite her best efforts to stay calm. She'd sent him that one message earlier, told him to prove himself with action, not words. And here he was, calling, probably ready to make promises he couldn't keep. She let it go to voicemail. Good, Maya said firmly. Let him sit with it. Let him actually feel the consequences of his choices for once. But even as she turned the phone face down, Elena couldn't stop wondering what he would have said. Whether he was angry or desperate or something else entirely. Whether he was capable of the kind of change she'd demanded, or whether this was just going to be another cycle of promises and disappointment. The phone buzzed with a voicemail notification. Elena ignored it. They finished dinner, cleaned up together, and settled in the living room with the last of the wine. Maya launched into a story about her latest project at work, something involving a micromanaging client and a design disaster that had somehow turned into a success. Sarah chimed in with her own work horror stories. Normal conversation, normal problems, normal life. Elena let it wash over her, feeling something she hadn't felt in years, peace. The anxious knot that had taken up permanent residence in her chest was still there, but it had loosened slightly, enough that she could breathe a little deeper, enough that she could imagine a future that didn't feel suffocating. After Maya left and Sarah went to bed, Elena finally allowed herself to listen to Victor's voicemail. She sat in the dark living room, phone pressed to her ear, bracing herself for whatever version of him would come through. His voice was quiet when it came, rough, like he'd been talking too much, or not sleeping enough, or both. Elena, I know you don't want to talk to me right now. I know I don't deserve your time or your attention or anything else from you, but I need you to hear this. A pause, and she heard him take a shaky breath. I saw someone today, a therapist, Dr. Sarah Chen. James recommended her. I've never done anything like this before, never thought I needed to, but you were right about all of it. I don't know how to be what you need because I don't know how to be vulnerable without feeling like I'm going to shatter. The Marcus thing, it broke something in me, made me believe that caring about people was the same as handing them a weapon to destroy you. And I know that's not fair to you. I know you're not Marcus, not even close. But fear doesn't care about fair. Another pause, longer this time. I'm not calling to ask you to come back. Not yet. I'm calling to tell you that I'm trying, really trying. Not because I think a few therapy sessions will fix everything, but because you deserve someone who's willing to do the work. And I want to be that person. I want to be the man you fell in love with, the one who existed before I let fear turn me into someone I don't even recognize. His voice cracked slightly. I love you, Elena. I never stopped. And I'm going to prove to you that love is more than just words, even if it takes months, even if it takes years, even if you decide in the end that I waited too long and you're better off without me. You deserve to see me try. The message ended, and Elena sat in the darkness with tears streaming down her face. Not because she was ready to forgive him, not because one therapy appointment erased 3 years of silence, but because for the first time she heard something in his voice that sounded like genuine understanding. Like he'd finally grasped the magnitude of what he'd done, what he'd been doing, how thoroughly he'd failed her while convincing himself he was protecting her. She didn't call him back, didn't text, just saved the voicemail and went to bed, letting his words echo in her head alongside her own determination not to settle for less than she deserved. The next morning, Elena woke to sunlight streaming through the window and a text from Maya with the name and number of her friend Janine. No pressure, the message said, but the door's open if you want to walk through it. Elena stared at the number for a long moment, then made the call before she could talk herself out of it. Janine Yang answered on the third ring, her voice warm and efficient. Maya's been singing your praises for the last 12 hours. Says you're brilliant with languages, have an eye for design, and need to get back into the art world. That's a generous interpretation, Elena said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The truth is, I've been out of the field for 6 years, and I'm basically starting over. The truth is that passion and intelligence matter more than gaps in a resume. Come in Thursday at 2. Let's talk about what you're interested in and see if there's a fit. No promises, but I'm always looking for smart people who actually care about the work. After hanging up, Elena sat with the phone in her hands, feeling the flutter of possibility in her chest. An interview. A chance. The first step toward building something that was entirely hers. She spent the next 2 days preparing, researching the Contemporary Art Center, reviewing current exhibits, catching up on 6 years of trends and movements in the art world. It felt like waking up muscles she'd forgotten she had, like remembering a language she used to speak fluently. Thursday arrived with the kind of crisp autumn weather that made the city feel alive. Elena dressed carefully, not in the designer outfits from her closet at the mansion, but in clothes she'd bought years ago. A blazer that actually fit her personality. Boots she'd chosen because she liked them, not because they matched an image. Small acts of reclamation. The Contemporary Art Center was housed in a converted warehouse in the Arts District, all exposed brick and industrial charm. Elena walked through the door 15 minutes early and was immediately struck by the energy of the place. People who looked like they actually cared about what they were doing. Art that challenged and provoked rather than just decorating walls. A space that felt alive. Janine turned out to be a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and an easy smile. She led Elena to a small office cluttered with catalogs and sketches and the organized chaos of someone who genuinely loved their work. So, Janine said, settling behind her desk, tell me why you want to be here. And please don't give me a rehearsed answer about passion for the arts. Tell me the truth. Elena took a breath, deciding in that moment to be honest. I need to remember who I was before I spent 6 years making myself smaller to fit into someone else's life. I used to love art because it made me feel something real. I want to help other people feel that too. And I need to build something that's mine, not attached to anyone else, just mine. Janine studied her for a long moment, then smiled. That's the most honest answer I've gotten in months. Let's talk about what that might look like. They talked for over an hour about Elena's background in art history, her language skills, her experience organizing events, about the center's upcoming exhibition featuring Latin American contemporary artists, and the need for someone to help with community outreach and donor relations, about the possibility of starting part-time, with room to grow into something more substantial. I can't promise you a permanent position right away, Janine said finally, but I can offer you a 3-month contract doing outreach and event coordination for the Latin American exhibit, 20 hours a week to start. If it works out, we'll talk about expanding the role. Elena felt something unfurl in her chest. Hope, possibility, the first tangible evidence that life outside the mansion could actually work. I'll take it, she said. When do I start? Monday, if you're ready. Come in at 9 and we'll get you oriented. Walking out of the center, Elena felt lighter than she had in years. She had a job, an actual job that had nothing to do with Victor or his world or the person she'd been expected to be. Something she'd earned on her own merit. She was halfway back to Sarah's apartment when her phone rang. Victor again. This time she answered. Hello, Victor. Elena. He sounded surprised that she'd picked up, like he'd gotten used to being sent to voicemail. Thank you for answering. I got a job, she said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, at the Contemporary Arts Center, starting Monday. There was a pause, and she could almost hear him processing this information. That's great, Elena. Really. You used to talk about wanting to work with art again. You remember that? I remember everything you told me. I just stopped asking. His voice was quiet. I'm sorry for that. For all of it. Elena stopped walking, standing on a street corner while the city moved around her. Victor, why did you call? I wanted to tell you I've been going to therapy, twice a week. Dr. Chen is helping me understand why I built the walls I did. It doesn't excuse anything, but I'm trying to figure out how to be different. He paused. And I wanted to ask if you'd be willing to meet. Just coffee, just talking, no pressure, no expectations. I want to see you. Every instinct Elena had developed over the last week screamed at her to say no, to maintain distance, to protect the fragile peace she was building. But there was something in his voice that made her hesitate, something that sounded like genuine change, or at least the beginning of it. I need time, Victor. I need to figure out who I am without you, without us. I can't do that if we're having coffee and falling back into old patterns. I understand. I do. But Elena, I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'll wait as long as you need. I'll do whatever work it takes. Because losing you showed me something I should have realized years ago. Having everything means nothing if I don't have you. Pretty words, Elena said softly, but I need more than words. I know. Let me prove it, however long it takes. After they hung up, Elena stood on the corner for a long moment, watching people rush past on their way to wherever they needed to be. She thought about Victor in therapy, confronting the fears that had shaped him, about the pain in his voice when he talked about losing her, about whether people could really change or whether they just became better at hiding who they'd always been. She didn't have answers, but for the first time, she had space to figure them out, space to build her own life, space to decide what she wanted instead of just reacting to what Victor needed. That weekend, Elena started moving pieces of her life into place. She opened a checking account in her name only, updated her resume, met with a lawyer Sarah recommended to discuss separation agreements and what her rights were if she decided to make the break permanent. Practical steps, building blocks of independence. Sunday evening, she returned to the mansion with Sarah as backup. Not to stay. Just to collect more of her things, the clothes she actually wanted, the books that mattered, the small objects that had made the place feel even remotely like home. Victor wasn't there when they arrived. James met them at the door, professional as always, but with something like approval in his eyes when he looked at Elena. Mr. Hale is at an appointment, he said. He asked me to tell you that you're welcome to take whatever you need. No restrictions. Elena and Sarah moved through the house methodically, packing boxes with the pieces of Elena's life that had been scattered through 20,000 square feet of marble and perfection. It felt strange, surreal, like she was dismantling a museum exhibit of a marriage that had existed more in theory than in practice. In the bedroom, Elena found a letter on her pillow. Victor's handwriting, The bold strokes she recognized from years of watching him sign documents. She almost didn't read it, almost shoved it in a box to deal with later or never. But curiosity won. The letter was short, direct, pure Victor. Elena, I'm giving you space because that's what you asked for. But I need you to know what I'm doing while you're gone. I've restructured my schedule to make therapy a priority. I've started delegating more of the business, so I'm not working 18-hour days. I've been reading books about emotional vulnerability and healthy relationships. Yes, I know how that sounds, but I'm desperate enough to try anything. I'm learning that the empire I built became an excuse to avoid the hard work of actually being present. I'm learning that control is not the same as care. I'm learning that I've been a coward hiding behind the excuse of protection. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect you to come back. But I expect myself to become the man who deserves you, even if I never get the chance to prove it, even if you build a beautiful life without me. You asked me to show you, not tell you, so I won't make more promises. I'll just do the work and hope that someday maybe you'll trust me enough to let me show you what I'm learning. I love you. I've always loved you. I'm just finally learning what that actually means. V. Elena folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket, not trusting herself to examine how it made her feel. Not here. Not yet. Not when she was still building the foundation of who she was without him. They finished packing and loaded boxes into Sarah's car. As they pulled away from the mansion, Elena looked back one more time at the house that had been her home and her prison, her dream and her nightmare. She didn't know if she'd ever come back. Didn't know if Victor could actually become the person he was claiming to work toward. Didn't know if love and effort were enough to rebuild something that had been broken for so long. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She was done disappearing, done making herself small, done accepting silence as love. Whether her future included Victor or not, it was going to include her fully present, fully herself, fully alive. And that was worth more than all the mansions and security and comfortable distance in the world. Monday morning arrived with Elena's alarm going off at 7. She dressed in clothes that made her feel competent and real, made coffee in Sarah's kitchen, and took the subway to the Contemporary Arts Center like thousands of other people heading to jobs they'd earned themselves. Janine met her with a thick folder of information, introduced her to the team, and spent the morning walking her through the Latin American exhibit project. There were donors to contact, community organizations to partner with, events to coordinate. Real work, work that mattered. By lunch, Elena's head was spinning with information, and she loved every second of it. "You're a natural," Janine said, watching Elena organize outreach contacts with the kind of efficiency that came from years of managing charity events. Maya wasn't exaggerating. "I'm just grateful for the chance," Elena said honestly. "Well, keep this up and the chance might turn into something permanent. We could use someone with your skills and your languages, especially someone who actually cares about making art accessible." That evening, Elena came home to Sarah's apartment exhausted and exhilarated, feeling muscles she'd forgotten existed starting to strengthen. She'd used her brain, made decisions, contributed something real to the world. She'd remembered what it felt like to matter for what she could do, not who she was married to. Her phone buzzed with a text from Victor. Not a plea, not a demand, just a simple message. "James told me you came by yesterday. I hope you found everything you needed. I'm proud of you for the job. You're going to be amazing." Elena stared at the message for a long time, feeling the complicated tangle of emotions it stirred up. Grief for what they'd lost. Anger at the years wasted. Hope that maybe, possibly, he was actually changing. Fear that she was fooling herself. She didn't respond. Not yet. She needed more than words, more than texts, more than promises made from a distance. She needed to see sustained change. Needed to know that this version of Victor, the one going to therapy, the one restructuring his life, the one finally doing the work, wasn't just a performance designed to win her back. She needed time to build herself back up before she could even consider whether there was a marriage worth saving. But for the first time since she'd packed that suitcase, Elena felt like she was moving forward instead of just running away. Like she was building something instead of just escaping something else. And that felt like progress. 3 weeks passed in a blur of learning and growing and remembering what it felt like to be Elena Vale, not just Victor Hale's wife. The Contemporary Arts Center became her anchor, a place where her value was measured in ideas and effort rather than appearance and performance. Janine expanded her responsibilities after the first week, impressed by how quickly Elena connected with community organizations and how naturally she spoke with potential donors in 3 different languages. "You're wasted on part-time," Janine said one afternoon, dropping a stack of files on Elena's desk. "I'm putting together a proposal for the board. Full-time position as community outreach director. Interested?" Elena looked up from the donor spreadsheet she'd been organizing, her heart doing a strange flip. "Are you serious?" "Completely. You've done more in 3 weeks than the last person did in 6 months. Plus the donors actually like you, which is more rare than you'd think." Janine leaned against the desk. "Think about it. No pressure." "Well, maybe a little pressure, because I need an answer by Friday." After Janine left, Elena sat staring at the files, feeling the weight of possibility. A real position. A career, not just a stopgap. The kind of opportunity she dreamed about before marriage had become her entire identity. She pulled out her phone to text Sarah, then hesitated when she saw 3 missed calls from an unknown number and a voicemail. Probably a donor or one of the community partners she'd been working with. She hit play while pulling up her contact list. "Mrs. Hale, this is Dr. Sarah Chen. I'm Victor's therapist. I know this is unusual, but I'm calling because Victor asked me to reach out to you. He wanted you to know that he's doing the work, and he wanted to offer you the option of attending a session with him. Not couples therapy. This would still be his individual session, but he'd like you to hear what we've been discussing. No obligation whatsoever. If you're interested, my office number is..." Elena stopped the message, her chest tight. Victor was using his therapist to contact her. Part of her wanted to be angry about the boundary crossing, but the larger part recognized what this actually was. Not manipulation. Transparency. Him literally showing her instead of just telling her. She saved the number without calling back, needing time to think. That evening, curled up on Sarah's couch with tea and the constant hum of city traffic through the windows, Elena finally told her sister about the call. "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked, always cutting straight to the heart of things. "I don't know. Part of me wants to see if he's actually changing, if this is real or just another performance." Elena wrapped her hands around her mug. "But part of me is terrified that if I see him doing the work, I'll forgive him before he's actually earned it. That I'll fall back into old patterns because I want so badly for this to work." "So don't go alone," Sarah said simply. "Tell the therapist you'll come to a session, but I'm coming with you. Moral support. Reality check. Someone to remind you of what you actually deserve if you start to waver." Elena considered this. "You'd do that?" "Elena, I'd do a lot more than that. I'd walk into Victor's office and read him the riot act if I thought it would help. Sitting quietly in a therapist's office is nothing." 2 days later, Elena called Dr. Chen's office. The receptionist scheduled her for the following Tuesday at 4, confirmed that Sarah could attend as support, and mentioned that Victor had already been informed and was grateful Elena was willing to come. The days leading up to Tuesday felt endless. Elena threw herself into work, finalizing details for the Latin American exhibit's opening reception, reaching out to local schools about student tours, writing grant applications with Janine's guidance. Keeping busy kept her from obsessing over what she might hear in that therapy session, what version of Victor she might encounter. Monday night, Maya showed up at Sarah's apartment with a bottle of good wine and a pep talk prepared. "Okay, ground rules for tomorrow," Maya announced, pouring generous glasses for all 3 of them. 1. You don't owe him forgiveness just because he's in therapy. 2. You don't have to decide anything immediately. 3. If he says anything that feels like manipulation or deflection, you get up and walk out. 4. Sarah's there to kick you under the table if you start making excuses for him. "I'm excellent at tactical kicks," Sarah confirmed. Elena laughed despite her nerves. "You two act like I'm going into enemy territory." "You're going into Victor's territory," Maya corrected. "Same thing. Look, I know you loved him, probably still do if we're being honest. But love isn't enough if he's not willing to fundamentally change who he's been for the last 3 years. You deserve more than apologies and promises, Elena. You deserve action." "I know," Elena said quietly. "That's why I'm going. To see if the action matches the words." Tuesday arrived cold and gray, the kind of November day that made the city feel smaller and more intimate. Elena dressed carefully, choosing strength over softness. Tailored pants, a blazer, boots that made her feel grounded. War paint for a different kind of battle. Sarah met her at the Contemporary Arts Center at 3:30, and they took the train together to Dr. Chen's office in a renovated brownstone in a quiet neighborhood. The waiting room was deliberately calm, with soft lighting and abstract art, and the kind of furniture that invited people to actually relax. Elena couldn't relax. Her leg bounced nervously until Sarah put a hand on her knee. "Breathe," her sister said. "You're in control here. Not him. You." At precisely 4 o'clock, Dr. Chen emerged. She was younger than Elena expected, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that Elena immediately appreciated. "Elena, thank you for coming. And you must be Sarah." She shook both their hands. "Before we go in, I want to be clear about what this is. This is Victor's session. You're here as an observer, and you're welcome to participate if you feel comfortable, but there's no pressure. My primary responsibility is to Victor's treatment, but I invited you because he's been working on accountability and transparency. This felt like a way to demonstrate that." "I appreciate you calling," Elena said. "I wasn't sure if I should come." "I'm glad you did. I think it will be illuminating for everyone." Dr. Chen led them down a hallway to a comfortable office with windows overlooking a small garden. "Victor's already inside. Ready?" Elena nodded, gripping Sarah's hand briefly before letting go and walking through the door. Victor stood when she entered, and Elena felt the full impact of seeing him for the first time in nearly a month. He looked different, thinner maybe, or just more worn. The careful polish that usually defined him was still there, but something beneath it had shifted. He looked more real, more human, more uncertain. "Elena," he said, and his voice carried a vulnerability she'd never heard before. "Thank you for coming. Sarah, thank you for being here." Sarah nodded coolly, taking a seat in one of the chairs against the wall. Elena sat in the chair Dr. Chen indicated, positioned at an angle to Victor's seat, close enough to have a conversation, far enough to maintain distance. Dr. Chen settled into her own chair with a notepad. "Victor, you wanted Elena to hear what we've been working on. Why don't you start there?" Victor's hands clasped together, and Elena noticed they weren't quite steady. "We've been talking about fear, about how the Marcus situation didn't just teach me to be cautious about business. It taught me that vulnerability was dangerous, that caring about people gave them power to destroy you." He looked at Elena, really looked at her, and she saw pain in his eyes that wasn't being carefully managed or strategically deployed. "I thought I was protecting you by keeping distance, protecting myself by not letting you all the way in. Dr. Chen's been helping me understand that what I was actually doing was destroying the thing I was trying to preserve." "Tell Elena what you realized last week," Dr. Chen prompted gently. "About the pattern." Victor took a breath. "I realized that I was recreating my childhood. My father loved my mother, but he showed it by controlling everything around her, managing what she knew about the business, making decisions without her input, keeping her safe by keeping her ignorant. I watched their marriage and promised myself I'd never be like him. His jaw worked, but I became exactly like him. Different methods, same result. I kept you at arm's length, convinced myself it was protection, when really it was just control wearing a different mask." Elena felt something crack in her chest. She'd never heard Victor talk about his parents this way, had never heard him draw the connection between his father's distant love and his own behavior. "What are you doing differently?" she asked quietly. "I'm learning to sit with discomfort instead of managing it away, to actually feel things instead of strategizing around them, to understand that trust is something you build through vulnerability, not something you protect through distance." Victor's eyes stayed on hers. "Dr. Chen asked me last week what my greatest fear was. I said losing you. But that wasn't true, and she called me on it. My greatest fear is being vulnerable and having that vulnerability used against me. I'd rather lose you than risk that kind of exposure." "Had rather, Doctor," Chen corrected gently. "Had rather," Victor amended. "Because I'm learning that losing you is worse than any betrayal, that the walls I built to protect myself just left me alone in a fortress of my own making, that you can't have intimacy without risk." Elena sat with his words, feeling the truth in them, but also the years of silence that had come before. "Victor, you're saying the right things, but I heard right things before. 2 years ago when I told you I felt invisible. 18 months ago when I asked if we could do couples therapy. A year ago when I said I didn't know how much longer I could live like this. You promised to change every time. And then nothing actually changed. I know. Victor's voice was rough. I made promises without doing the work to understand why I couldn't keep them. I thought wanting to change was the same as actually changing. I thought good intentions were enough. They're not, Elena said, and heard steel in her own voice that surprised her. I need to see sustained change, Victor. Not a month. Not 3 months. Real, fundamental, lasting change in how you show up, how you communicate, how you share yourself. I know, he said again. That's why I'm not asking you to come back. I'm asking for the chance to prove that I can be different, however long that takes. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. Victor, why don't you tell Elena about the homework you've been doing? Victor pulled out his phone, and Elena tensed instinctively before realizing he was just showing her something. He turned the screen toward her. It was filled with notes, pages and pages of them. Every day I write about something I'm feeling and why, he said. Not business strategy, not problem solving, just feelings. Fear, anger, grief, hope. Whatever's actually happening under the surface. Doctor, Chen said I spent so many years managing my emotions that I stopped actually experiencing them. This is practice in paying attention. Elena scrolled through the notes, seeing raw admissions she'd never imagined Victor would write. About his fear of inadequacy. About the grief of his father's death that he'd never properly processed. About the shame of becoming exactly what he'd promised himself he wouldn't be. About missing her so much some days he could barely breathe. I'm also in a men's group, Victor continued. Other guys working on emotional availability. Some of them have lost their marriages already. Some are trying to save them. All of us are trying to figure out how to be different than what we were taught men should be. He paused. And I've cut my work hours by 30%, delegated 3 major accounts, started actually taking weekends. Because you were right. I was using work as an excuse to avoid the harder work of actually being present. Sarah spoke for the first time. What happens when things get difficult? When you're stressed or scared or someone threatens your business? Do you fall back into old patterns? Victor looked at Sarah, and Elena saw him resist the urge to deflect. Probably. I've been working on this for a month. These patterns took 15 years to build. I'm not fixed. I'm just finally aware of how broken I've been. But I have tools now. I have Dr. Chen. I have the men's group. I have James, who's agreed to call me out when he sees me retreating into control mode. James is helping you, Elena asked, surprised. James has been telling me I was an idiot for years. I finally started listening. Victor set his phone down. Elena, I know words are cheap. I know I've made promises before that I didn't keep. But I need you to know that this is different. Not because I'm suddenly fixed, but because I finally understand what I was doing wrong. I was trying to change my behavior without addressing the fear underneath it. Now I'm doing the harder work, the stuff that actually matters. Dr. Chen glanced at her notes. Elena, I want to be clear that I can't tell you whether Victor's change is permanent. Nobody can know that yet. What I can tell you is that the work he's doing is genuine. He's not performing for you. He's doing this for himself because he's finally recognized that the life he was living was unsustainable. Elena absorbed this, feeling the complicated tangle of hope and caution warring in her chest. Everything Victor was saying sounded right, felt different than the surface promises of the past, but she'd been hurt too many times to trust easily. I need to ask you something, she said to Victor, and I need you to be completely honest. Do you actually want to be married to me, or do you just hate losing? The question hung in the air between them. Victor's face went through several emotions before settling on something that looked like resignation. A month ago, I would have said I wanted to be married to you and believed it completely while not examining what that actually meant. Dr. Chen's been helping me understand that I wanted the idea of you, the comfort, the stability, the proof that I was capable of having something normal, but I wasn't actually willing to do the work of being married to you as a real person with needs and feelings and the right to be fully seen. He met her eyes. Now, I want to be married to the Elena who walked out, the one who demanded more, the one who's building her own life and doesn't need me, because that's the real you, and that's the person I fell in love with 7 years ago before I got scared and tried to tame you into something manageable. Elena felt tears burning behind her eyes. You can't tame people, Victor. You can only love them or lose them. I'm learning that. His voice cracked slightly. The hard way. They sat in heavy silence for a moment before Dr. Chen spoke. Elena, is there anything else you need to hear from Victor today? Elena thought about all the questions she'd carried for 3 years, all the silent dinners and lonely nights and moments of feeling completely invisible while standing right next to him, all the pain that had accumulated into the suitcase she'd finally packed. I need to know what happens if I give you another chance and you fail, she said. What happens when you get scared again? When business gets dangerous? When vulnerability feels like too much? Then I come back to this office and work through it instead of shutting you out, Victor said. Then I use the tools I'm learning instead of falling back on silence. Then I choose discomfort over distance. And if I fail at that, if I fall back into old patterns and can't pull myself out, then I let you go for good. Because you deserve someone who can show up, and if I can't be that person after all this work, then I need to love you enough to step aside. Sarah made a small sound from her chair, and Elena glanced at her. Her sister's face was carefully neutral, but her eyes said, "Be careful. Don't trust too easily. Protect yourself." Elena looked back at Victor, at this man she'd loved and lost and might be finding again. I can't come back yet. I need to see sustained change. I need to keep building my own life. I need to know that if we try again, it's because we're both choosing it from a place of health, not desperation. I understand, Victor said. How long do you need? I don't know. Months, probably. Maybe longer. I need to get solid in my own identity before I can even consider being part of a marriage again. Then that's how long I'll wait. Victor's hands unclenched slightly. Can I ask one thing? Can we have dinner once a month? Just to talk. No pressure. No expectations. Just two people who used to share a life trying to figure out if they still can. Elena looked at Dr. Chen, who gave a small nod. Structured contact can be healthy. It allows you both to practice new patterns in a bounded way. Once a month, Elena agreed carefully. Public places, time limits, and if either of us feels like it's not working, we can stop. Deal. Victor's shoulders dropped slightly, like he'd been holding tension she hadn't even noticed. Thank you for coming today, for listening, for giving me any chance at all. Elena stood, and Sarah immediately joined her. I'm not doing this for you, Victor. I'm doing this for me. To see if the marriage I thought we had is actually possible, or if it was always just a fantasy. Well, either way, you deserve to know the truth, Victor said. They left Dr. Chen's office together but parted on the sidewalk. Elena watched Victor get into the car James had waiting, watched him look back at her one more time before the door closed. Then she turned to Sarah, feeling emotionally wrung out and strangely hopeful at the same time. Well, Sarah asked, what do you think? I think he's trying, Elena said slowly. I think he actually understands what he did wrong. But I don't know if understanding is enough. I don't know if people can really change the fundamental things about themselves. Time will tell, Sarah said, linking her arm through Elena's. Good thing you're not in a hurry. They took the train back to Sarah's neighborhood, stopping for Chinese takeout on the way. Over egg rolls and lo mein, Elena told her sister about the job offer Janine had made, about the possibility of full-time employment doing work she actually cared about. Take it, Sarah said immediately. Build your own foundation. Then if you and Victor figure things out, you're coming from a place of choice, not need. And if you don't figure it out, you have a life that's yours. Elena thought about that as she fell asleep that night, about choice versus need, about the difference between a marriage built on desperation and one built on two whole people choosing to share their lives, about whether she and Victor could ever get to that place or if too much damage had been done. She didn't have answers, but for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she was asking the right questions. The next morning, Elena walked into Janine's office and accepted the position. Full-time. Benefits. A salary that wasn't much compared to what Victor provided, but felt like a fortune because she'd earned it herself. You won't regret this, Janine said, shaking her hand. Welcome to the team officially. Elena spent the rest of the day in meetings about the Latin American exhibit, which was opening in 2 weeks. There were still donors to confirm, caterers to finalize, 100 small details that needed attention. She threw herself into it, grateful for work that demanded her full presence. That evening, her phone buzzed with a text from Victor. James told me you took the job. Congratulations. You're going to be amazing. Short, simple. Supportive without being intrusive. Exactly what she'd needed to hear. Elena looked at the message for a long time before responding. Thank you. First dinner's in 2 weeks. After the exhibit opening, I'll pick the place. I'll be there. Proud of you, Elena. She set the phone down and looked around Sarah's small apartment at the life she was building piece by piece. It wasn't the mansion with its marble floors and expensive art. It wasn't the life of luxury she'd walked away from. But it was real. It was hers. And it was teaching her that she could survive without Victor, which meant if she ever chose to go back, it would be from strength, not weakness. The exhibit opening arrived in a flurry of last-minute preparations. Elena coordinated with caterers, greeted donors, gave impromptu tours in Spanish to community members who'd never been to an art gallery before. She watched people connect with the art, saw children's faces light up at the vibrant colors and bold statements, felt the satisfaction of work that mattered. Janine found her near the end of the evening, champagne in hand. You did this. You made this happen. Take a minute and feel good about it. Elena looked around at the crowded gallery, at the successful event she'd helped create, and felt something settle in her chest. Pride. Accomplishment. The knowledge that she was capable of building something meaningful on her own. She was standing near the refreshment table when she felt someone's eyes on her. Turning, she found Victor at the entrance, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't their scheduled dinner. This was her space, her accomplishment, her world. Their eyes met across the crowded room. He raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement, then turned and left before she could react. Elena stood frozen, trying to process what had just happened. Victor had come to support her, had witnessed her success, had left without making it about him, had respected her space while still showing up. It was such a small thing, and it meant everything. That night, lying in bed, Elena found a text waiting. I'm sorry for showing up uninvited. I wanted to see you in your element. You were radiant. The exhibit was beautiful. The work you did was clear in every detail. I'm proud of you. I'll see you next week for dinner. V. Elena read the message 3 times, feeling the careful respect in it. The acknowledgement that he'd crossed a boundary, the genuine pride without ownership, the recognition that she was building something entirely her own. Maybe he was changing. Maybe this time was different. Maybe there was still a chance for them to find their way back to each other in a healthier way. Or maybe not. Maybe the damage was too deep. Maybe she'd outgrow the woman who'd needed him. Maybe they'd become different people who couldn't fit together anymore. She didn't know. But she was finally okay with not knowing, finally okay with letting time reveal the truth instead of forcing answers before she was ready. Elena typed a response. Apology accepted. See you next week. Then she turned off her phone and went to sleep, dreaming of art galleries and conversations yet to be had, and a future that was finally, blessedly uncertain in all the right ways. The restaurant Elena chose for their first dinner was deliberately neutral territory, a small Italian place in her neighborhood, warm and unpretentious, the kind of spot where couples shared wine and conversation without performance or pretense. She arrived 10 minutes early, needing the time to settle her nerves, to remind herself that this was just dinner, just talking, just 2 people seeing if there was anything left worth saving. Victor was already there when she walked in, seated at a corner table with a clear view of the door. He stood when he saw her, and Elena noticed the small changes immediately. No power suit tonight, just dark jeans and a sweater that made him look younger, more approachable, more like the man she'd fallen in love with before empire building had consumed him. You look beautiful, he said as she sat down, and there was no calculation in the compliment, just simple honesty. You look different, Elena replied. Good different. They ordered wine and fell into the strange dance of 2 people who'd once known everything about each other trying to figure out what they still knew. Victor asked about the exhibit, and Elena found herself talking animatedly about the community response, the school groups that had come through, the woman who'd cried in front of a painting because it reminded her of her grandmother's village in Mexico. You're lit up when you talk about it, Victor observed, and there was something wistful in his voice. I don't think I've seen you this alive in years. That's because I wasn't, Elena said quietly. I was existing, going through motions. This is what living actually feels like. Victor absorbed that, his jaw working slightly. I did that to you. Made you feel like existing was all you were allowed. We both did it. I let myself disappear because it felt easier than fighting for space every single day. Elena took a sip of wine. I'm done with easier. I want real now, even if real is harder. They talked for 2 hours, and it was different than any conversation they'd had in years. Victor told her about his therapy sessions, about confronting the ways his father's emotional absence had shaped him, about learning to identify feelings instead of just managing them away. He talked about the men's group, about hearing other guys struggle with the same fears of vulnerability, about realizing he wasn't alone in being terrified of intimacy. Elena talked about rediscovering who she was outside of being his wife, about the satisfaction of earning her own money, about the small apartment that felt more like home than the mansion ever had, about learning that she was enough on her own, which somehow made the possibility of being part of a partnership feel less desperate. I don't want to need you, she said as they shared tiramisu. I want to choose you. There's a difference. I'm learning that, Victor said. Dr. Chen says I've been confusing dependency with love, thinking that if you needed me, you'd stay, never understanding that real love is about choosing to stay when you don't need to. They parted on the sidewalk with an awkward moment where neither was sure about physical contact. Finally, Victor offered his hand and Elena took it, feeling the familiar warmth of his palm against hers. Same time next month? He asked. Same time next month, Elena confirmed. She walked back to Sarah's apartment feeling cautiously hopeful. It had been a good dinner, real conversation. No manipulation, no performance. Just two broken people trying to figure out if they could heal together or if healing meant going separate ways. The monthly dinners became a rhythm over the next several months. December at a Thai place where they talked about childhood Christmases and family dysfunction. January at a French bistro where Victor admitted he'd been reading poetry again, something he hadn't done since college. February at a steakhouse where Elena told him about being offered a promotion at the Contemporary Arts Center, and he celebrated her success without trying to take credit or offer unsolicited advice. Between dinners, they texted sporadically. Never daily, never intrusive. Just occasional check-ins that felt like two people maintaining connection without drowning in it. Victor would send photos of books he was reading on emotional intelligence and healthy relationships. Elena would share pictures of exhibits she was working on. Small windows into separate lives that were slowly, carefully considering the possibility of intersection. In March, Elena finally took Victor up on his standing invitation to attend one of his therapy sessions. Dr. Chen welcomed her back, and this time Elena came alone, feeling stronger and more grounded than she had 4 months ago. I want to talk about forgiveness, Victor said once they were settled. Not asking for it, understanding what it actually means. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. Go on. I used to think forgiveness meant Elena saying it was okay, what I did, that we could move past it and pretend the last 3 years didn't happen. Victor looked at Elena. But I'm learning that's not how it works. Forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. It doesn't mean trust automatically returns. It just means choosing not to let the past poison the future. What are you asking for, Victor? Elena asked softly. Permission to keep trying, to keep showing up, to prove that the change is real and lasting. He paused, his hands clasped tightly together. And acknowledgement that even if you forgive me, you might still choose to move on. That forgiveness and reconciliation aren't the same thing. Elena felt something shift in her chest. This was what she'd needed to hear, that he understood she didn't owe him anything just because he was doing the work. That her forgiveness, if it came, was a gift, not a transaction. I do forgive you, she said, and watched surprise flash across his face. Not because you've earned it or because enough time has passed, but because holding on to the anger was keeping me stuck. Forgiveness is for me, not for you. It's me choosing to let go of the weight I've been carrying. And us? Victor's voice was barely audible. I don't know yet, Elena admitted. You're doing the work. You're being different, I see that. But I need more time to trust that it's permanent. To trust that you won't fall back into silence the first time things get hard. That's fair, Victor said, though she could see the disappointment in his eyes. Dr. Chen leaned forward. Elena, what would you need to see to feel safe trying again? Elena thought about that. What did she need? What would make her willing to risk her heart again on a man who'd already broken it once? I need to see you handle a crisis differently, she said finally. Right now things are relatively calm. You're in therapy, doing the work, showing up for dinners. But what happens when business gets dangerous? When someone threatens you or the empire? When fear kicks in and every instinct tells you to protect me by pushing me away? That's when I'll know if this is real. Victor absorbed this, and Elena saw him resist the urge to promise it would be different. Instead, he just nodded. Then I guess we wait for the test. The test came sooner than either of them expected. 3 weeks later, Elena was at the Contemporary Arts Center coordinating a donor event when her phone rang. James's name on the screen, which was unusual enough that she answered immediately. Elena, I need you to stay calm, James said, his voice tight with controlled urgency. There's been a situation. Victor's fine, he's safe, but there was an attempt today. Castellano's people. They got closer than they should have. Elena's blood went cold. How close? Close enough that we're relocating him temporarily. Close enough that he's making decisions about security protocols. James paused. He asked me to call you. Wanted you to hear it from me, not the news. And he wanted me to tell you that he knows what you're thinking, that this is where he usually shuts down and pushes people away. He's asking if you'll come to the safe house. Not to hide you, to show you that he's choosing differently this time. Elena's hands were shaking. This was it, the test she'd asked for, the moment where Victor would either prove the change was real or fall back into the patterns that had destroyed their marriage. Where? She asked. James gave her an address in a secure building downtown. I'll have a car pick you up in 20 minutes. Elena, he's scared. I've never seen him scared like this, but he's trying. She told Janine she had a family emergency, grabbed her coat, and was waiting on the curb when the armored car arrived. The drive felt endless, her mind racing through possibilities. Victor could have died today, could have been killed because of the empire he'd built, the enemies he'd made. And instead of protecting her by keeping her ignorant, he was asking her to come to him, to be part of the crisis instead of shielded from it. The safe house was a penthouse apartment with security that would make a government facility jealous. James met her in the lobby, his face grim. He's upstairs. Elena, he's going to want to tell you everything, details he would have hidden before. It's going to be bad. Are you ready for that? I don't know, Elena said honestly, but I'm here anyway. Victor was standing at the window when she walked in, his back to the door, shoulders rigid with tension. He turned when he heard her, and Elena saw fear in his eyes that wasn't being carefully managed or hidden away. You came, he said, and his voice cracked slightly. You asked me to. Elena set down her purse, her heart pounding. Tell me what happened. And he did. Everything. The intelligence about Castellano's people that had been building for weeks. The attempted intercept that morning that had gotten too close. The 3 security personnel who'd been injured protecting him. The fact that they'd had information about his routines they shouldn't have had, which meant someone inside had talked. I wanted to call you this morning, Victor said, pacing now, the fear channeling into movement. When I first got the intelligence, every instinct told me to keep you away, to handle it alone, to protect you by keeping you in the dark. But that's the old pattern, the one that destroyed us. So I told James to call you as soon as it was over, to be transparent even though every fiber of my being wants to hide this from you. Elena watched him pace, seeing the war happening inside him, the pull toward old patterns, the effort to choose differently. What happens now? She asked. Heightened security for a few weeks. James is hunting for the leak. Castellano's people are being dealt with. Victor stopped pacing, turned to face her. And I want you to stay here. Not because I'm making decisions for you, because I'm asking, because having you close feels safer than having you out there where I can't see that you're okay. But if you say no, if you say you need space or you don't want to be part of this, I'll accept that. Your choice, Elena. Always your choice. This was the moment, the test, the place where she could see if Victor had truly changed or if crisis would revert him to the controlling, distant man he'd been. Tell me the truth, Elena said. Are you asking me to stay because you want me close or because you want to control my movements? Victor was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the question. Both, he said finally, and the honesty in his admission surprised her. I want you close because I'm scared, and you make me feel less alone in that. And yes, part of me wants to control your movements because that feels safer than trusting you to make your own choices about risk. I'm aware of both impulses, and I'm trying to let you choose instead of deciding for you. Elena moved closer to him, close enough to see the exhaustion in his face, the genuine fear he wasn't hiding. I'll stay tonight because you're scared and I want to be here. But Victor, I need you to keep being this honest, even when it's hard. Even when the honest answer is that you want to control things. I can work with honesty. I can't work with you making unilateral decisions and pretending it's for my own good. I know, Victor said quietly. I'm trying. It goes against every instinct, but I'm trying. They ordered takeout and ate on the couch, and Victor told her more about the business than he'd shared in years. Not because she asked, but because he was choosing transparency. He told her about this Castellano situation's full scope, about the risks he'd been managing, about the fear that loving her made him vulnerable to exactly the kind of attack that had happened today. That fear is still there, he admitted, but I'm learning that pushing you away doesn't eliminate it. It just means I'm alone with it. And being alone with fear is worse than being vulnerable with someone I trust. Do you trust me? Elena asked. Really trust me? Victor thought about that. I want to. I'm choosing to, every day, even when it's terrifying. Trust isn't something I feel naturally anymore. It's something I have to practice. But I'm practicing, Elena, with you, because you're worth the risk. They talked late into the night, and when exhaustion finally won, Victor set her up in the guest room without assuming anything. But as Elena was getting ready for bed, she found herself walking back to the living room where he was still sitting, staring out at the city lights. Victor? He turned, surprise flickering across his face. I don't want to sleep alone tonight, Elena said quietly. Not because we're fixing everything, not because this means we're back together, but because you're scared and I'm scared and maybe we don't have to be scared alone. Something in Victor's face crumbled. Relief and gratitude and vulnerability all mixed together. Are you sure? I'm sure. They lay in the master bedroom, in the same bed but with careful distance between them. No expectations, no assumptions. Just two people who'd been apart for 6 months finally choosing proximity again. Elena? Victor's voice came through the darkness. Yeah? Thank you. For coming tonight. For seeing me try. For giving me any chance at all. Elena rolled toward him, and in the dim light from the city outside, she could see his face. You're doing the work. I see that. I see you trying. Is it enough? The vulnerability in his voice was raw. Will it ever be enough? I don't know yet, Elena said honestly. But tonight? Tonight was good. You handled crisis differently. You let me in instead of pushing me away. That matters. Victor reached out slowly, giving her time to pull back, and took her hand. Their fingers interlaced, and Elena felt the familiar rightness of it, alongside the unfamiliar newness. They were different people than they'd been 6 months ago. The question was whether these new versions could build something better than what they'd lost. She fell asleep holding his hand, and when she woke in the morning, they were curled together, bodies remembering what their minds were still figuring out. The weeks following the Castellano situation became a crucible. Victor stayed in heightened security mode, but he kept Elena informed every step of the way. When he wanted to make decisions about her safety, he asked instead of commanded. When fear told him to push her away, he talked about the fear instead of acting on it. When the investigation into the security leak got dangerous, he gave her the full picture and let her decide her own comfort level with risk. It wasn't perfect. There were moments when he slipped into old patterns, when distance felt safer than vulnerability. But now he caught himself, apologized, corrected course. The change wasn't linear, but it was real. Their monthly dinners became weekly coffee dates, then twice-weekly lunches. Then Elena started spending weekends at the safe house, and then occasionally at the mansion when security allowed. Not moving back in. Not giving up her apartment or her independence. Just slowly, carefully reintegrating their lives. In May, Victor asked if she'd come to a therapy session where Dr. Chen wanted to talk about what reconciliation might actually look like if they chose to try. I want to be clear about something, Dr. Chen said once they were settled. Reconciliation doesn't mean going back to how things were. It means building something entirely new with the wisdom you've both gained from the pain. What would that look like for us? Elena asked. Victor pulled out a piece of paper. He'd come prepared. I've been thinking about that, making lists, trying to envision what a healthy marriage between us would actually be. He unfolded the paper, and Elena saw his handwriting covering both sides. I want to propose something, not reconciliation yet. A trial period. 3 months where we're intentionally together, building new patterns, seeing if we can actually sustain this. What would that involve? Elena asked carefully. You keep your apartment and your job and your independence. But we spend 4 nights a week together, sometimes at your place, sometimes at mine. We have weekly check-ins where we talk about what's working and what isn't. We go to couples therapy with Dr. Chen every other week. And at the end of 3 months, we both assess honestly whether this is sustainable or whether we're forcing something that can't work. Elena looked at the paper, at the thought he'd put into this, at the structure that would give them both safety and space to figure things out. And if it doesn't work, if we try and realize the damage is too deep, then we both walk away knowing we gave it our best shot, Victor said. No regrets, no what-ifs, just clarity. I think that's incredibly mature, Dr. Chen said. Elena, how does this feel to you? Elena sat with the question, examining her own feelings honestly. She was scared of being hurt again, scared of losing the independence she'd fought so hard to build. But she was also hopeful. Hopeful that the man sitting across from her had genuinely changed. Hopeful that they could build something better than what they'd lost. I want to try, she said finally, with all the boundaries you mentioned, with the understanding that this is a trial, not a commitment, with the agreement that we're both allowed to change our minds. Victor's face transformed, hope and relief and something that looked like love in its most vulnerable form. When do we start? They started the next week. Victor helped her move some things to the mansion but insisted she keep her apartment. You need a space that's entirely yours, he said. Somewhere you can go when you need distance or perspective or just to remember who you are outside of us. The trial period was harder than Elena expected and better than she'd hoped. There were moments of profound connection. Victor sharing fears he'd never voiced, Elena trusting him with vulnerabilities she'd learned to hide. There were also moments of friction, when old patterns tried to reassert themselves, and they had to consciously choose differently. Their couples therapy sessions with Dr. Chen became a laboratory for practicing new communication. Learning to fight fairly, learning to express needs without demands, learning that healthy conflict was better than peaceful distance. You're both doing remarkable work, Dr. Chen said 6 weeks into the trial. Victor, you've sustained change for 8 months now. Elena, you've maintained your boundaries while remaining open. The question is whether you can envision this as sustainable long-term. Elena thought about the life they were building. Victor showing up at her exhibit openings, genuinely interested in her work, her attending his business dinners, and actually being consulted about decisions that affected them both. Conversations that went deep instead of staying surface. Silences that were comfortable instead of suffocating. I can see it, she said slowly. Not the marriage we had. Something better. Something built on actually knowing each other. Victor reached for her hand. I can see it too. And I want it. Not because I'm afraid of losing you, though I am, but because building this with you is better than anything I've built alone. The 3-month trial period ended in August with both of them choosing to continue, not rushing back into the marriage as it had been, but constructing something new. Elena kept her apartment but spent most nights at the mansion. She kept her job and her independence while choosing to build a partnership. Victor kept doing therapy and the men's group, understanding that the work of being emotionally available wasn't something you completed, but something you practiced daily. In September, on what would have been their 7th anniversary, Victor asked Elena to dinner at the restaurant where they'd had their first monthly meal. She thought it was just another date night until she arrived and found the private room he'd reserved. I'm not proposing, he said quickly, seeing her panic. We're already married, and I'm not assuming we're staying that way. But I wanted to mark this day, to acknowledge what we lost and what we're building. He'd put together a photo album, not of their wedding or the early years when everything looked perfect. Photos from the last 9 months. Elena at her exhibit opening, radiant and alive. Victor at a therapy session, raw and vulnerable. The two of them at coffee, caught mid-laugh by Sarah. Moments of real life, real connection, real work. This is who we are now, Victor said. Not the people we were. Not the marriage we had. These people. Doing this work. Building this connection. And I want you to know that I see how hard you've worked to give me this chance. I see the risk you took coming back. I see you choosing this every day, even though I gave you every reason not to. Elena paged through the album, feeling tears building. I see you too. I see you showing up differently. I see the work you're doing. I see you choosing vulnerability even when it terrifies you. I love you, Victor said. I've always loved you. But I'm finally learning how to love you well. How to love you in ways that make you bigger, not smaller. How to love you without needing to control you. I love you too, Elena said, and meant it in a way she hadn't been able to mean it for years. I love who you're becoming, who we're becoming together. They didn't make grand declarations that night, didn't promise forever or pretend the work was done. They just sat together, eating good food and talking honestly, being present with each other in ways they'd forgotten were possible. Over the following months, they continued building. Elena got promoted to Director of Community Outreach at the Contemporary Arts Center. Victor restructured his business to prioritize the life he wanted to live rather than just the empire he wanted to build. They fought sometimes, real fights about real things, but they fought fairly and always came back to each other. On a cold evening in February, more than a year after Elena had walked out with a suitcase, they sat together in the mansion's living room. The space had changed. Elena's books on the shelves now, her art on the walls, evidence of two people actually sharing a life rather than one person decorating for an absent partner. I want to ask you something, Victor said, setting down the book he'd been reading. Elena looked up from her laptop where she was reviewing grant applications. Okay? Are we okay? Really okay? Because sometimes I'm afraid this is too good to be true, that I'll wake up and you'll be gone again, and I'll realize I dreamed the whole thing. Elena closed her laptop and moved closer to him on the couch. We're not perfect. We still have work to do. But yes, we're okay. We're better than okay. We're actually married now, in the ways that matter. What changed? Victor asked. For you. What made you able to trust me again? Elena thought about that, about the long months of watching him choose differently, the consistency of his effort, the vulnerability he had learned to offer, the way he'd handled every crisis by letting her in instead of pushing her away. You did, she said simply. You changed, not overnight, not because you made promises, but slowly, consistently, through 1,000 small choices to be different than you were. And I changed too. I learned that I could survive without you, which meant I could choose you from strength instead of need. Victor pulled her closer, and Elena settled against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. I don't ever want to take this for granted, he said quietly. I don't ever want to forget what it felt like to lose you. Then don't, Elena said. Keep doing the work. Keep showing up. Keep choosing vulnerability even when it's hard. That's how we make this last. Deal, Victor murmured into her hair. They sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that used to feel empty, but now felt full. Full of presence. Full of trust. Full of two people who'd learned the hard way that love wasn't about possession or protection or maintaining perfect images. Love was about seeing someone fully and choosing them anyway. About being vulnerable enough to be seen and brave enough to stay. About building something together that made both people bigger instead of requiring one to disappear. The mansion no longer felt like a prison. Elena's apartment no longer felt like an escape. They were just spaces where two people who'd almost lost each other were learning to build a life that honored them both. Years later, when people asked Elena about her marriage, she never talked about the wedding or the mansion or the picture-perfect early days. She talked about the night she packed a suitcase, about choosing herself, about the courage it took to leave and the courage it took to come back, about a man who'd loved her enough to let her go and then done the work to become worthy of her return. She talked about how sometimes the most loving thing you could do was refuse to disappear, how sometimes saving a marriage meant being willing to end it, how sometimes the only way to find each other was to first be willing to be completely alone. The suitcase that had started everything sat in their closet now, empty but significant. A reminder of the night everything changed, the night Elena chose herself and Victor finally understood what he was losing, The night that broke them apart so they could build themselves back together, stronger and more real than they'd ever been before. Love, Elena learned, wasn't about never struggling. It was about how you struggled. Whether you faced the hard things together or retreated into silence. Whether you did the work or just made promises. Whether you chose growth or comfort. She and Victor chose growth. Every day. In 1,000 small ways. And that choice, renewed constantly, was what transformed a broken marriage into something worth keeping. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer empty or suffocating. It was peaceful. The silence of two people who didn't need to fill every moment with words because they trusted the connection underneath. And when they did speak, they spoke truth. Hard truths and soft truths and all the truths in between. They'd learned that honesty was more intimate than any physical connection. That being truly known was both terrifying and the only thing that made love real. On their 8th anniversary, Victor asked Elena what she wanted to celebrate. This, she said simply, gesturing at the life they'd built. The messy, complicated real life where both of them could breathe. Just this. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything, because the greatest love story isn't about never falling apart. It's about being brave enough to break, humble enough to rebuild, and wise enough to construct something better than what you lost. Elena and Victor had broken. They'd rebuilt. And what they'd constructed in the aftermath of that breaking was a marriage that finally deserved to be called a partnership, two whole people choosing each other, not from desperation, not from need, but from the kind of love that only grows in the space between courage and vulnerability, between holding on and letting go, between the person you were and the person you're brave enough to become. They'd found their way home, not to a mansion or an apartment or any physical space, but to each other, to presence, to truth, to love that made room for both of them to be fully, completely, messily alive. And that was the real happy ending. Not perfect, not without struggle, but real and true, and worth every hard step it took to get there.